They laughed when he walked in, limping, quiet, older than any of them could imagine. They thought he was just another old man looking for a job he couldn't handle. What they didn't know was that he had once led missions no one would ever read about, and that before the day was over, the FBI would send a black SUV to thank him in person. Welcome to the Storyscape, where we share true and inspired tales about hidden valor, unseen sacrifice, and the quiet power of those who never needed to brag. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe and join us in honoring them. James Martin stepped through the glass doors at exactly 8:45 a.m. Nobody paid much attention at first, just another applicant in the line for security positions. But the closer he came to the reception desk, the more the young men already waiting began to notice him and smirk. He was older, not just older by a few years, but decades. His hair silvered, his shoulders slightly stooped, a deep scar fading along the line of his jaw. "Seriously?" one of the younger applicants whispered to his friend. "What's he going to do, guard the place with a cane?" James didn't react. He never reacted to that sort of thing. The ones who joked were always the same, the ones who had never been tested when it mattered. He rested a hand on the reception counter, setting down a slim, brown folder. "Mr. Martin?" the receptionist asked, trying to hide her surprise. "Yes," he said calmly. "Interview at 9. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "Of course. Please have a seat." James turned toward the row of chairs and sat carefully. His movements were measured, not because he was fragile, but because that was how he had been trained. Nothing wasted, no motion without purpose. From across the room, another applicant in a tactical polo leaned back with an exaggerated sigh. "Betty can't even pass the physical," he muttered. James rested his hands over the folder in his lap. He knew better than to correct them. 10 minutes later, a door opened at the end of the hall. A supervisor appeared, young, clean-cut, wearing a suit that was just a little too expensive for the role. His eyes swept the applicants until he found the one person he hadn't expected. "James Martin." James rose. "Here." The supervisor didn't greet him with a handshake. He barely concealed the impatience in his voice as he turned on his heel. "This way." James followed him down a corridor lined with framed motivational posters. Excellence, integrity, leadership. Words that looked good on walls, but meant very little when it was time to act. The supervisor motioned him into a small interview room. He didn't offer a seat. James had to take it himself. "I'm Mr. Daly," he said, tapping a pen against the folder. "You understand this role requires long shifts, a lot of standing, possibly confrontation." "No offense, but you're sure you're up for that?" James studied him a moment. The boy didn't realize how young he sounded. "I'm aware of the requirements," James replied simply. Daly opened the folder. His brow furrowed at the list of previous positions, some listed vaguely, some marked confidential. "You don't have a lot of recent employment," Daly pointed out. "No," he agreed. "I retired some years back." "And why come back to work now?" James folded his hands. "I prefer to stay useful." Daly leaned back, exhaling sharply. "Mr. Martin, with respect, our clients expect a certain look. They expect reassurance. I don't think—" James reached into the folder and removed a single laminated page. He slid it across the desk without a word. Daly frowned. He glanced at it, and his mouth stopped moving. "Special Activities Division, Tier 1 Commendation for Valor, Operations Classified." For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the ceiling vent. James stood. He didn't bother taking the paper back. "Thank you for your time." He left the interview room as quietly as he'd entered. And when the door clicked shut behind him,
Mr. Daly realized too late he hadn't just dismissed an old man. He'd dismissed a man who once did things he couldn't begin to imagine. James stepped back into the lobby, where the same half-bored applicants sat slouched over their phones. Some of them looked up, expecting to see a defeated man with slumped shoulders. But James's expression hadn't changed. He walked to the reception desk and paused. The young woman behind the counter fidgeted as he looked her in the eye. "Thank you," he said quietly. She swallowed. I'm sorry, sir." He inclined his head. "Don't be. You weren't the one making decisions." With that, he turned and walked out the door. The heavy glass swung shut behind him, muffling the murmurs that broke out as soon as he was gone. Outside, the morning had turned bright and cold. The sun glanced off windshields along the curb. James paused at the sidewalk, adjusting the cuff of his worn jacket, and looked up at the building sign one last time. It meant nothing to him now. His boots tapped against the cracked pavement as he began the long walk back toward the center of town. At the corner, a delivery truck idled. The driver watched him in the side mirror, puzzled by the solitary figure moving at a pace that didn't seem to hurry for anyone. James didn't mind the looks. He was used to them, used to people underestimating the man behind the gray hair and the limp. He stopped at a bus bench and lowered himself to sit. The folder rested on his knees, the laminated citation peeking out from the edge. For a moment, he just watched the traffic pass. He thought about the years that had slipped by, since the last time he'd felt like he belonged somewhere, since the last time he'd been surrounded by men who didn't need explanations or apologies. Most of them were gone now, some buried in places the world would never visit, some names never even etched into the memorial walls. That was how it worked. Quiet service, quiet endings. Inside the building, Mr. Daly was still staring at the laminated citation. He'd picked it up as soon as Martin had left, studying the faded typeface and the blacked-out lines. He didn't know what Tier 1 really meant. He'd heard the term, maybe read it in a book once, but it hadn't seemed real, just another legend, until he looked into the eyes of a man who had lived it. Now every word he'd spoken in that interview felt cheap. James watched a city bus lumber past, belching a cloud of exhaust. A young man stepped off, glancing at him with a puzzled expression before hurrying away. He rested both hands on the folder, feeling the familiar heaviness settle in his chest. He had thought, just for a moment, that maybe this time would be different. Maybe someone would look past the lines on his face and see the years of discipline, sacrifice, and service. But the world had changed. It wanted youth, polish, performance, and he had none of those left to give. What he still carried, what no one seemed to value anymore, was the kind of quiet resilience you only earned the hard way. He closed his eyes, remembering the day he'd been handed that citation. It had come with no ceremony, no crowd, just a nod from the man who had pinned it to his file, and a single sentence he'd never forgotten. "Someday, this piece of paper will be the only proof of who you really were." James exhaled slowly. Maybe that day had finally arrived. He was still sitting on the bench when the phone began to buzz in his jacket pocket. James considered ignoring it. Few people called him anymore, and none of them ever had urgent reasons. But something about the persistent vibration made him reach for it anyway. The number was unfamiliar, an area code he hadn't seen in years. He pressed answer and lifted the phone to his ear without speaking. "Mr. Martin?" A woman's voice, professional but cautious. He didn't reply immediately. "This is Agent Foster," she continued, as if she knew he was listening. "Veteran Bureau of Investigation. May I have a moment of your time? He closed his eyes. The bureau. It had been a long time since he'd heard that introduction directed at him. Yes, he said finally, his voice low. I understand you were at an interview this morning, at Dominion Security? His chest tightened. For a moment he thought perhaps they were going to accuse him of something absurd, lying about his service, fabricating his past. I was. There was a pause, filled only by the distant hiss of a passing truck. Sir, she said, her tone softening, I want you to understand, this call isn't about that company.
Then what is it about? Another pause. When she spoke again, her words were deliberate, chosen with the same precision he'd once used to mark coordinates. It's about acknowledgement. James didn't answer. There are records, she went on, that never made it into public archives, operations that remain sealed, but there are people here who have never forgotten your name. A long silence stretched between them. He felt the old ache in his chest, the mingled pride and regret he'd never been able to separate. You don't have to say anything, she continued, her voice gentler now. But there's a vehicle nearby. If you'd allow it, we'd like to speak in person. James looked down at the folder on his lap. All right, he murmured. Thank you, Mr. Martin. They'll be with you in a moment. The line clicked off. He lowered the phone to his thigh and exhaled. 2 blocks away, in a black SUV parked near a convenience store, the driver adjusted the earpiece tucked discreetly behind his collar. Confirmation received, he said into the mic clipped to his lapel. Proceed, came the response. He turned the ignition and eased the vehicle into traffic, moving without urgency. In the lobby of Dominion Security, the receptionist picked up her phone to check a text from her sister and froze. The message was only 3 words. Did you know? Attached was a grainy scanned image of an old commendation with James' name in block letters and a classification stamp she'd never seen before. Her stomach twisted. No, she thought, she hadn't known. James watched as the black SUV turned the corner and slowed. The driver didn't honk, didn't wave him over. He simply parked and stepped out, a tall man in a plain dark suit, eyes shielded by mirrored sunglasses. He crossed the street without hesitation, stopping a respectful distance away. Mr. Martin. James nodded. The man removed his sunglasses, revealing a gaze that wasn't dismissive or amused, but steady. Sir, he said low, may I offer you a ride? For a moment he considered declining. He thought about the folder in his hand, the citation that had been his only proof of everything he'd once been. Then he thought about how it felt to be recognized without having to explain. He rose carefully. All right, he said. And as he followed the agent to the waiting vehicle, the curious stares of pedestrians fell away behind him, just another invisible moment in the long, quiet record of his life. The ride was quiet. James sat in the back seat of the SUV, his hands resting over the folder like a shield. He studied the passing buildings, old brick storefronts, fast food drive-thrus, a few empty lots where he remembered houses standing decades ago. The agent in the passenger seat didn't turn around. He simply spoke in a calm, level tone. Mr. Martin, we're taking you to a local field office. You're not under any investigation. We just felt you deserved a conversation in person. James nodded faintly. The words sounded rehearsed, but the respect in the man's voice didn't. Outside, the city blurred past. He felt a strange lightness, a kind of reluctant gratitude he couldn't quite name. After all these years of slipping into the background, of having strangers look right through him, here were people who knew exactly who he was and had come anyway. The SUV slowed in front of a nondescript building, its windows shaded.
Two men waited at the entrance, dressed the same as the agent beside him. No insignia, no ranks, just the quiet posture of professionals who didn't need to announce themselves. When the door opened, James stepped out slowly. "Sir," one of them greeted with a nod. He nodded back. No handshakes, no forced ceremony. Inside, the lobby was sparsely furnished. White walls, a few chairs, and a desk behind thick glass. One of the agents gestured to a small conference room. "If you'd be comfortable waiting here, sir, Director Walsh will join you in a moment." James entered and sat. The door remained ajar as if to reassure him he could leave whenever he wished. He set the folder on the table and rested his palms flat beside it. The walls were bare except for a single framed document, something about service and duty. It struck him how many times he'd stood in rooms like this on the other side of the conversation. Back then, he had been the man explaining, reporting, debriefing. Now he was the relic, an old story someone else wanted to understand. A minute later, a woman stepped through the door. She was in her 50s, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Her suit was impeccably pressed. "Mr. Martin," she said, her voice warm but professional. "Thank you for coming." He inclined his head. She took the seat across from him and folded her hands. "I'm Director Walsh. I oversee archival security and special recognitions." James didn't reply. He waited. She studied him for a moment, as if to measure how much to say. "We've been reviewing a backlog of operations files. In recent years, there's been a push to formally acknowledge contributors whose records remained sealed for decades." Her gaze shifted to the folder. "Your name appears in over a dozen classified logs, some of which still aren't fully redacted." James exhaled, slow. "I never asked for acknowledgement," he said quietly. "I know, and that's why it matters." She reached into her briefcase and removed a slim black binder, setting it carefully on the table. "No headlines, no ceremony, but I believe there should be clarity, especially when men like you are still here to receive it."
He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were copies of reports he hadn't seen in 40 years. After-action summaries, commendations he hadn't known were filed. Statements from men he'd served with, whose names brought back a wash of memories. One paragraph was highlighted in yellow. Subject displayed extraordinary composure and tactical skill under sustained fire. His actions directly resulted in the survival of all team members present. His throat tightened. Director Walsh spoke gently. "You don't have to accept anything today," she said, "but we felt you deserved to know. Your record is not forgotten." James closed the binder slowly. "Why now?" he asked. She held his gaze. "Because too many wait until a man is gone to say he mattered." The ride was quiet. James sat in the back seat of the SUV, his hands resting over the folder like a shield. He studied the passing buildings, old brick storefronts, fast food drive-thrus, a few empty lots where he remembered houses standing decades ago. The agent in the passenger seat didn't turn around. He simply spoke in a calm, level tone. "Mr. Martin, we're taking you to a local field office. You're not under any investigation. We just felt you deserved a conversation in person." James nodded faintly. The words sounded rehearsed, but the respect in the man's voice didn't. Outside, the city blurred past. He felt a strange lightness, a kind of reluctant gratitude he couldn't quite name. After all these years of slipping into the background, of having strangers look right through him, here were people who knew exactly who he was and had come anyway. The SUV slowed in front of a nondescript building, its windows shaded. Two men waited by the entrance, dressed the same as the agent beside him. No insignia, no ranks. Just the quiet posture of professionals who didn't need to announce themselves. When the door opened, James stepped out slowly. "Sir,"
One of them greeted with a nod. He nodded back. No handshakes, no forced ceremony. Inside, the lobby was sparsely furnished. White walls, a few chairs, a desk behind thick glass. One of the agents gestured to a small conference room. "If you'd be comfortable waiting here, sir, Director Walsh will join you in a moment." James entered and sat. The door remained ajar, as if to reassure him he could leave whenever he wished. He set the folder on the table and rested his palms flat beside it. The walls were bare except for one framed document, something about service and duty. It struck him how many times he'd stood in rooms like this, on the other side of the conversation. Back then, he'd been the man explaining, reporting, debriefing. Now he was the relic, an old story someone else wanted to understand. A minute later, a woman stepped through the door. She was in her 50s, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Her suit was impeccably pressed.
"Mr. Martin," she said, her voice warm but professional. "Thank you for coming." He inclined his head. She took the seat across from him and folded her hands. "I'm Director Walsh," she said. "I oversee archival security and special recognitions." James didn't reply. He waited. She studied him for a moment, as if measuring how much to say. "We've been reviewing a backlog of operations files. In recent years, there's been a push to formally acknowledge contributors whose records remained sealed for decades." Her gaze shifted to the folder. "Your name appears in over a dozen classified logs, some of which still aren't fully redacted." James exhaled slow. "I never asked for acknowledgement," he said quietly. "I know," she agreed, "and that's why it matters." She reached into her briefcase and removed a slim black binder, setting it carefully on the table. "No headlines," she said. "No ceremonies. But I believe there should be clarity, especially when men like you are still here to receive it." He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were copies of reports he hadn't seen in 40 years, after-action summaries, commendations he hadn't known were filed, statements from men he'd served with whose names brought back a wash of memories. One paragraph was highlighted in yellow. "Subject displayed extraordinary composure and tactical skill under sustained fire. His actions directly resulted in the survival of all team members present." His throat tightened. Director Walsh spoke gently. "You don't have to accept anything today," she said, "but we felt you deserved to know your record is not forgotten." James closed the binder slowly. "Why now?" he asked. She held his gaze. "Because too many wait until a man is gone to say he mattered." James didn't speak for a long moment. He simply sat with his hand resting over the binder, feeling the weight of years pressing down in ways he hadn't expected. When he finally looked up, Director Walsh was watching him with the same steady calm he'd seen in the eyes of people who'd done their own hard things. "This isn't about ceremony," she said quietly. "It's about truth." He nodded. That word truth felt heavier than any metal. She reached into her case one more time and withdrew a small object wrapped in dark velvet. Without fanfare, she set it on the table and unfolded the cloth. A brass challenge coin lay in the center. It was simple. No elaborate insignia, no glossy finish. On one side, the embossed words, "Valor recognized." On the other, "Service without witness." He felt his throat tighten. It was the kind of recognition that didn't come with press releases or public commendations, the kind only shared, quietly,
between those who knew. Director Walsh spoke again. When we began cross-referencing records, a number of names came forward, men who served under you. They wanted you to have this. He didn't reach for it right away. He simply looked at the coin, then at the binder, and then back to the director's face. "Did you know," he said after a moment, his voice low, "that sometimes it feels easier to forget it all?" She nodded. "I do." He exhaled. "It doesn't mean you can." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." When he finally closed his hand around the coin, he felt the metal cool against his palm. Not heavy exactly, but weighted with something he couldn't name. He slipped it carefully into the breast pocket of his jacket. Then he gathered the binder, tucking it under one arm as he rose. Director Walsh stood as well. "No official records will be changed without your consent. If you'd prefer your history remain sealed, it can." He studied her, appreciating that she didn't try to convince him either way. "I'll think on it," he murmured. "That's all we ask." Outside the conference room, the same agents waited by the exit. They didn't look surprised when he stepped out with the binder in hand. One of them inclined his head respectfully. "Sir," he said simply. James nodded back. No ceremony, no applause, just the quiet recognition that passed between men who understood the cost of certain paths. They offered him a ride home. He accepted not because he needed it, but because it seemed to matter to them that he did. The drive was quiet again. When the SUV reached his block, he rested his hand briefly on the binder. "Thank you," his voice low. The driver met his gaze in the mirror. "Sir, it's an honor." James stepped out onto the sidewalk as the vehicle pulled away. For a long moment, he stood with the morning sun warming his back, watching the last of the tinted windows disappear around the corner. He thought of the young supervisor in that bright office, of the dismissive glance he'd received, and he realized it didn't matter. Because respect, he knew, wasn't something you demanded. It was something you carried, quietly, like the coin in his pocket. When James stepped into his small apartment, the morning light was filtering through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the worn carpet. He set the binder on the kitchen table with a care that felt almost ceremonial. Then he pulled out a chair and lowered himself into it, exhaling the quiet breath of a man who had held too much inside for too long. For a few minutes, he simply sat with his hands folded over the folder. No phone buzzing, no voices demanding more of him, just silence. He reached into his pocket and drew out the coin. The brass glimmered dully in the light. Valor recognized, service without witness. His thumb traced the letters, feeling the shallow grooves, a proof he'd never asked for, but maybe, in the hidden part of his heart, always needed. His gaze drifted to the far wall, where an old photograph hung in a modest wooden frame.
It showed 8 men standing in front of a rust-pitted helicopter. Younger versions of themselves, all sunburnt and exhausted, but standing shoulder to shoulder. 3 of those men were long gone. 2 more he'd lost touch with before the world had begun to move too fast for old friendships to keep pace. He wondered what they would think of this day, of the coin, of the binder, of the memory that refused to stay buried. Part of him knew they'd smile, not because they thought he needed recognition, but because they'd always understood. The work you do in silence doesn't vanish when you walk away. It lives on in the way you stand, the way you carry yourself, the way strangers can sense something they don't have a name for, but feel all the same. A soft knock sounded at his door. He rose, surprised, and opened it to find the young woman from the reception desk. She held something in her hands, a small white envelope. I didn't know where else to bring this,"
she said, her voice unsteady. He studied her, puzzled. It came to the office, she explained. Addressed to you. He took it gently. Thank you. She hesitated, glancing down at the envelope, then back at his face. I'm sorry for how they spoke to you. James looked at her for a long, quiet moment. You didn't need to come, he said. I know, but you did. She swallowed and nodded. That matters, he said, and he meant it. When she left, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded note. Mr. Martin, some of us knew who you were the moment you walked in. Thank you for everything you carried so the rest of us never had to. A friend. He closed his eyes. Sometimes he thought the smallest acknowledgement weighed more than any ceremony ever could. He returned to his chair and set the note beside the binder. Then he reached into the folder he'd brought to that interview, still neatly organized, still ready to prove itself to people who had never earned the right to question it. One by one, he began to remove the pages, laying them out in careful rows. Not for validation, not for pride, just to remember. Because as much as he had tried to let it all fade, the truth was simple. Some histories are meant to be carried, even when the world forgets, even when no one is left to ask. So I ask you now, have you ever met someone like James Martin? Someone whose quiet strength was never about recognition, but about doing what needed to be done. Tell us their name in the comments. Tell us what they taught you. Because here at the Storyscape, we believe no legacy should ever be invisible. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity never expires. And next time you see someone the world has overlooked, look a little closer. You might be standing in the presence of someone who once held the line for all of us.